the topic I want to tackle today is about there are a lot of narratives, right, out there, especially in the area of politics in South Africa, right, where the idea or the perception or the pushed narrative is that black South Africans are where they are progressing the way they progress from an economic perspective because of government help, right. The idea that black South Africans can do things themselves is usually discounted in the country. And I've spent the recent years trying to push back against that narrative, right? Because that is not true. And the title of my talk today is Black South Africans, Self-Driven Achievements and the Power of Markets. Because when they do things for themselves, they are doing it within the market system, right? Which we do have in South Africa. Yes, it's being suppressed and being regulated by the government, but we still do have the markets, right? They do operate in the country. We still do have the private sector. That's where I want to focus on within the next 15 to 20 minutes of my talk. And what you see, the African Markets Institute, I'm going to tell you a bit about it later. It's basically a think tank that I've started focused on basically telling the story that I'm going to tell you in the next 15 to 20 minutes, right? Okay, let's jump into it. I think that when we talk about black people, when we talk about how they operate and how they engage as economic agents in the economic system, it's best to look at the black middle class, right? Because I think that's where we should get our heads around. That's where we should focus, right? We understand that there are some billionaires and people who make a lot of money and so on. Many of them also, the most famous, richest black people we know. We do know that some of them have been beneficiaries of black economic empowerment, right? Including our current president. But I want us to move away from the rich people for a moment for now, right? And speak about the black middle class, because it is really a class that needs to be understood better, and also, and more opportunities created for them in the country. Now, looking back at the early formation of, what you could call South Africa, Union of South Africa back then, between 1910 and the 1950s, there was a small black middle class that emerged. Of course, it was made up of teachers, the clergy, nurses, and civil servants. It was small because of the conditions at the time, but it was there, right? In other words, there was a kind of a middle class that was in place, as small as it was at the time, right? And then we have, during the times of the apartheid system, the higher apartheid, 1960s to 1980, economic growth in the 60s and 70s, combined with industrial expansion, opens up opportunities in manufacturing and services. This led to the modest increase in urban black professionals, managers, and clerical workers, right? So we had professions. There's a very fascinating book by a lady, I believe it's a lady, Madeline Lipton, right? Madeline Lipton. It's titled Capitalism and Apartheid. I think then it shows years 1910 to something like 1980. That's a fascinating book because it's got the statistics of professionals, black professionals at the time. In fact, she, shows the numbers that there was a rise in black professions, right? Even during the time, right? Black people educating themselves, trying to improve their skills, and trying to build, right, in a country where there was a government that was pursuing racial segregation, right? So there was always that, that push by many people to improve their lives, right? Within the markets that they could afford to operate in at the time. The picture I have here is basically of Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo outside their law firm back in the 1950s, I believe, yeah. And they're running a law firm, right? Was it a perfect law firm? No. It was facing serious challenges, but these people were building, right? They were educated. They could pursue what was in front of them to improve their lives. So that was the kind of, this small, limited black middle class was there at the time facing its challenges, but it was growing, right? That's very important to highlight. highlight. And remember, these are people improving their lives, doing things for themselves, in a system, really in a government system that is constraining them. You could go on to mention people like Richard Maponya, Herman Mashaba, whom I believe is going to speak here tomorrow. You could go on to speak about Roger Sisi, Sam Maturiani, who just passed away last year. There's really, and many others. Those are the names we know. But there are many other people out there who are really pushing. In film, I'm from KwaZulu-Natal. I am staying about the Wusa. In film, in KwaZulu-Natal, there's a guy called, I think, Simon Sabela. Simon Sabela is one of the very big names in the film industry, right? He was in the Shaka Zulu series. He did many great things going back to the, I think, decades before the end of apartheid, right? He was known internationally. So there were many people in sports and so on. People were really pushing to make things better and to push for their development in South Africa. Now, given all those challenges, here's our sins. And one element I'm going to point out to you may be quite controversial, but that's okay. I've been controversial enough with the things I say. So in my analysis and observation, right, what suppressed the growth of the middle class, of the black middle class before 1994, was of course the apartheid system, right? The rules and constraints and so on by the apartheid government. But there is one thing that is not mentioned, and that was the issue of culture as well. I'll give you one example, and this was widespread. By the way, it wasn't only a South African thing. You could also find it in countries like India, and so on, in other developing countries. And that is the issue of culture. That's a quick example. When my parents were growing up, I'm from KwaZulu-Natal, as I said, rural KwaZulu-Natal, Phumlani, and then grew up in Stenga, which is more of a township, small town, and then went to Rhodes University, UCT, and then came here to work, right? Now, my mother tells me a very fascinating, but also disappointing, story. And that is when they were growing up, my grandfather had 2 wives, and both of them, they're still alive, by the way, and they still don't get along, even though their men died in 1992, they still don't get along. Right, so my grandfather from my mother's side had 2 wives, right? And then he had 6 kids from the grandmother from my side, and I think 7 kids from the other mother, right? Now, on my mother's side, my grandmother, who was an older wife, in Zulu we call them Mamkulu, there were 4 girls and 2 boys. And guess what? My grandfather's view of the world or belief was that there is no need to send a girl to school, because for what? That was back in that, right? And he wasn't alone when my mother tells me. He believed that with many of his friends, that for a girl, there's not for a girl to go to school. Boys can go, but even when they go, they would usually go when they are slightly older, right? Or some of them do not go to school, right? But there was a belief that a girl should just be raised and then go and get married, right? And as a result, my mother's siblings, 4 of them actually, he didn't send them to school. In fact, he realized that later that he was wrong when he was about to die in the end of apartheid, right? Because my mother said he had many regrets, right? And my parents, all the siblings were already old at the time, and many of them already having husbands, right? And that was the case in many places. So there were many things that were happening that were really constraining the growth or the potential of black people. Other than, of course, the apartheid system, which was bad and horrible, but there were practices that were cultural that were holding us, back, or that have held us back. Some would argue that some of these things, though now they may be in different forms today, they are still there, the cultural dynamics, right? And they can be found in many countries across the African continent. So now that means that how we also behave and how we do things has an impact as a people on how we move forward from an economic perspective. So these 2 elements, I think, are very important to think about, that they were constraining to the black middle class. Are we seeing changes now? Of course. of course, things have changed, right? The dismantling of apartheid that went off more than about 30 years ago, end of apartheid system. And of course, culture has changed, right? Really, there is no parent who believes that a girl child cannot go to school. It's totally out of the way now. So the dismantling of apartheid opened access to education, professional jobs, and housing markets for Black South Africans. This even before the apartheid era, over the past 30 years, and how we can build forward as a united nation. Pursuing what? Pursuing pro-market policies, the rule of law in the country. These are things we need to get right. Also to get right the issue of families. Our families are broken. We need to fix that as a society, right? And that is what this book is arguing, and that is its position. Because I think it's important that we change and adjust the narrative.